The range fell silent except for the wind cutting across the Arizona desert. 23 Marine marksmen stood in formation, their tan utilities bleached by years of sun and training. They'd come to observe what command called an integration exercise, though most knew it for what it really was: a show. The woman walking toward the firing line wore the same uniform, the same cover pulled low over her eyes, but everything about her presence drew skepticism. She carried her rifle with the casual efficiency of someone who'd done this 10,000 times, yet the whispers started immediately. Someone laughed. Another Marine elbowed his buddy, and the smirk spread down the line like wildfire. She was 5'4", maybe 120 pounds soaking wet, and she walked with a slight limp that made her look like she was fighting the earth itself with every step. Her name tape read KAEL in faded black letters. No one knew her. No one cared to. The range master, a gunnery sergeant with a face like carved granite, called the exercise to order. Standard qualifications: 500 yards, 10 rounds. The top shooter from each platoon had already fired. Their scores decorated the board behind them like trophies: 98, 96, 97. The best belonged to a staff sergeant named Vickers, a man built like a truck and known across the corps for his precision. He stood with his arms crossed, watching Cale approach the line with an expression somewhere between amusement and pity. She didn't look at him, didn't look at anyone. She dropped into position, adjusted her scope, and breathed. The first shot cracked across the desert, a miss. The target, a standard silhouette at 500 yards, remained untouched. Laughter erupted behind her, sharp and cruel. Someone muttered something about diversity hires. Another voice said she should stick to admin work. Cale didn't flinch. She cycled the bolt, adjusted, and fired again. Another miss. The laughter grew louder. Vickers shook his head and turned away, already bored. The range master glanced at his clipboard, his jaw tight. This was a mistake. Command had pushed this through, and now it was falling apart in front of everyone. Cale chambered a third round. The wind shifted. Her finger hovered over the trigger. Then she squeezed. The target punched backward, center mass, perfect. The laughter died. She fired again, another hit, then another. The rhythm became mechanical, surgical: 8 more rounds, 8 more hits. When the smoke cleared and the range master called ceasefire, every single shot after the first 2 had found its mark. 10 for 10. No wasted movement, no hesitation. The silence that followed wasn't respect. Not yet, it was confusion. Vickers stared at the target board. His score still sat at the top, but something had changed. The range master looked at Cale, then at the spotting scope, then back at her. She stood, slung her rifle, and walked off the line without a word. Her limp seemed less pronounced now. Maybe it had always been an illusion, a detail the eye invented to match expectation. Behind her, the whispers started again, but they sounded different this time. Uncertain. The Marines watched her go, and for the first time that morning, no one laughed. The sun climbed higher, baking the desert into submission. Cale disappeared into the shade of a logistics tent, her silhouette swallowed by shadows and canvas. Vickers stood frozen at the line, staring at her scorecard. The numbers didn't lie. 10 consecutive hits after 2 misses. It wasn't luck. Luck didn't cluster shots within a 2-inch radius at 500 yards. Luck didn't compensate for wind drift with that kind of precision. He'd been shooting competitively for 8 years, had trained at Quantico with some of the best marksmen in the world, and he'd never seen someone recover from a cold start like that. His pride told him to dismiss it. His instincts told him to pay attention. The exercise continued. Other shooters rotated through, their scores respectable but unremarkable: 93, 88, 95. The heat made everything shimmer, turning the distant mountains into liquid mirages. Cale reappeared an hour later with a canteen and a 1,000-yard stare that suggested she'd seen this routine before. She sat alone on an ammo crate, cleaning her rifle with methodical care. A lance corporal approached her, hesitant, and asked something the others couldn't hear. She answered without looking up. He nodded and walked away, his expression troubled. "Who is she?" someone finally asked. The question hung in the air until a captain standing near the command tent spoke up. His voice carried authority and something else: caution. Captain Elise Kale, formerly Air Wing, rotary pilot, did 2 tours in Helmand Province flying Hueys, took an RPG through her cockpit over Sangin in 2017, broke her back in 3 places, medically retired at 31. He paused, letting the information settle. She's been back on active reserve for 6 months. Qualified expert marksman last month at Pendleton, volunteered for this integration. The silence deepened. Someone muttered an apology no one heard. Vickers felt something cold slide down his spine. A pilot. Not just any pilot, a combat pilot who'd survived what should have been a fatal hit. That explained the limp. It didn't explain the shooting. He watched her work the cleaning rod through the barrel, her movements precise and unhurried. She looked small against the vastness of the desert, but size was a lie the eyes told when they didn't understand what they were seeing. "Why's she here?" another Marine asked. "Why marksman training if she's a pilot?" The captain folded his arms. "Because she can't fly anymore. Medical board won't clear her for cockpit duty, so she adapted." Adapted. The word felt insufficient. Vickers thought about what it meant to lose the thing you trained your entire life to do, to have it ripped away by violence and circumstance, and then to rebuild yourself into something else entirely. Most people would have taken the retirement, the pension, the quiet exit. Cale had chosen the harder road. He looked at her scorecard again. 10 for 10. Those first 2 misses suddenly made sense. She'd been calibrating. Letting the rifle tell her what the wind was doing, where the barrel wanted to go. It was a technique he'd heard about but never mastered. Sacrificial rounds to map the environment. Only someone with absolute confidence in their ability would waste ammo like that in front of an audience ready to mock them. Respect began to replace skepticism, but it was grudging, unspoken. The Marines were tribal creatures. Trust had to be earned not just in skill but in shared suffering, in blood and exhaustion and the unspoken language of people who'd faced death together. Cale was an outsider, a pilot playing at being a grunt. That she could shoot didn't change the fundamental equation. Not yet. Afternoon brought the real test. Vickers was called forward first. The range master explained the exercise: unknown distance, moving target, single shot. A silhouette on a motorized track appearing at random intervals between 300 and 800 yards. You got one chance. Miss and you were done, hit and you stayed in. It was a game the snipers played to separate the competent from the elite. Vickers had won it 3 times. He settled into position, controlled his breathing, and waited. The target appeared at 600 yards, moving left to right at a slow walk. He led it by half a body width and fired. The target spun. Hit. The crowd applauded. 3 more Marines took their turns, 2 hits, 1 miss. Then Cale was called forward. The laughter didn't return, but the doubt was still there, simmering beneath the surface. She took her position without ceremony. The motorized track hummed to life. Seconds passed. The target appeared at 750 yards, moving fast, right to left. An impossible shot. Even Vickers felt his chest tighten. She'd have to lead it by at least 2 body widths, account for wind, elevation, and the speed differential. He expected her to wait for an easier presentation. She didn't. The rifle cracked. The target jolted and collapsed. Dead center. No one applauded. They stared. The range master walked to the spotting scope, confirmed the hit, and marked her scorecard without comment. Cale stood, slung her rifle, and walked off the line. This time the Marines parted to let her through. It wasn't acceptance. It was something colder: recognition. She'd done something they couldn't explain away. Vickers felt his certainty waver. He'd spent years perfecting his craft, and this woman, this outsider, had matched him shot for shot. Worse, she'd done it with a casualness that suggested she wasn't even trying her hardest. The question wasn't whether she was good. The question was how good, and whether anyone was ready to find out. Evening came in shades of orange and purple, the desert cooling into something almost bearable. The Marines gathered around fire barrels outside the barracks, drinking contraband beer and replaying the day's events. Cale wasn't with them. She sat alone near the flight line, watching the stars emerge one by one. Vickers found her there an hour after chow. He carried 2 beers and offered one without preamble. She took it, nodded, and said nothing. He sat on the tarmac beside her, the silence between them comfortable in a way that surprised him. "Why'd you miss the first two?" he finally asked. She smiled faintly, the first real expression he'd seen from her all day. Wind was gusting, needed to see where the barrel was drifting. "That's a hell of a gamble in front of a hostile crowd. Would have been a bigger gamble to waste rounds downrange, pretending I knew what I was doing." He nodded, processing that. Confidence and humility wrapped into one. "You flew Hueys. For 6 years, best job I ever had." "What happened?" She took a long drink before answering. "We were extracting a patrol near Sangin. Taliban had them pinned in a compound. I came in low to avoid AA fire and someone got lucky with an RPG. Came through the chin bubble, took out my co-pilot instantly. Shrapnel shredded my lumbar spine. I kept us in the air long enough to get clear, then crashed in a poppy field half a click away." Her voice was flat, clinical. "They pulled me out, gave me a medal, told me I'd never fly again." Vickers felt something tighten in his chest. "And the shooting?" "Physical therapy was boring. I needed something to focus on. Turns out I'm better at this than I ever was at flying." She glanced at him. "Don't get me wrong. I'd trade every bullseye for one more hour in a cockpit, but you play the hand you're dealt." He understood then. The shooting wasn't compensation. It was survival. A way to stay connected to the core, to the identity she'd built over a decade of service. She wasn't trying to prove anything to them. She was proving it to herself. That realization shifted something fundamental in how he saw her. This wasn't about ego or rivalry. It was about a woman refusing to let circumstances define her limits. "You're better than me," he said quietly. She laughed, a short bark of sound. "Not yet, but I'm working on it." They sat in silence after that, drinking beer and watching the stars. Somewhere in the barracks, someone started playing music. The sound drifted across the base, a country song about loss and redemption. Kale closed her eyes and let the melody wash over her. For the first time all day, she looked at peace. Vickers finished his beer and stood. He offered his hand. She shook it, her grip firm. "Welcome to the unit," he said. She smiled. "I'm not in your unit." "You are now." He walked away, leaving her alone with the stars. Behind him, he heard her laugh again, softer this time. The sound followed him all the way back to the barracks, and he knew without question that everything had changed. The Marines would follow his lead. If he accepted her, they would too. It was tribal logic, unspoken but absolute. By morning, Kale would be one of them. Not because she'd asked for it, but because she'd earned it in the only language they understood: performance under pressure. The week that followed was a crucible. Command, sensing an opportunity, restructured the integration exercise into a full-scale competition. Kale and Vickers were designated team leaders, each selecting 4 Marines from the available pool. The objective was simple: a week-long field exercise culminating in a live-fire stalking drill. Points would be awarded for accuracy, stealth, fieldcraft, and leadership. The losing team would spend the following week on mess duty. The winning team would receive a 3-day Liberty Pass and bragging rights that would last years. Kale selected her team with care. She avoided the obvious choices, the loudest voices, the biggest egos. Instead, she picked Marines who watched and listened. A corporal named Diane Ortiz, small and wiry, who'd grown up hunting deer in Montana. A lance corporal named Marcus Ginn, a former competitive shooter with an engineering degree he'd never used. A PFC named Travis Nguyen, quiet and methodical, who maintained his rifle like it was a religious artifact. And finally, a staff sergeant named Marion Holt, a combat veteran with 2 deployments and a reputation for unshakable calm under fire. They were good, but they weren't the best. On paper, Vickers had the advantage. His team included the top shooters, the fastest runners, the Marines everyone expected to win. The exercise began at dawn. Both teams were inserted 10 clicks from base and given grid coordinates for a series of objectives. Each objective required them to locate, engage, and confirm hits on targets ranging from 400 to 1,000 yards. Stealth was paramount. Any team spotted by roving observers would lose points. Kale's team moved through the desert like ghosts. She'd learned patience in the cockpit, waiting for the perfect moment to extract wounded Marines under fire, and she applied that same discipline now. They covered ground slowly, using terrain to mask their movement. Ortiz scouted ahead, her small frame slipping between rocks and brush without disturbing the landscape. Jin calculated wind speed and elevation adjustments with the precision of a mathematician. Nguyen kept their equipment immaculate, ensuring every rifle, every scope, every piece of gear functioned flawlessly. Holt watched Kale's back, offering quiet advice when asked and silence when it wasn't. Vickers' team moved faster, more aggressively. They hit their first objective within 3 hours and confirmed kills on all targets. By midday, they were ahead on points. Kale's team reached their second objective just before sunset, exhausted but focused. The target was a mannequin at 800 yards, positioned on a ridgeline with minimal cover. The wind was unpredictable, swirling through the canyon below. Ortiz set up the spotting scope while Kale calculated the shot. The math was brutal. 800 yards in shifting wind required not just skill but intuition, a feel for how the air moved that couldn't be taught. She settled into position, her breathing slow and even. The first shot missed by inches. She adjusted and fired again. Hit. The observers marked their score and Kale's team moved on. They traveled through the night, using NVGs to navigate the desert's treacherous terrain. By dawn, they were behind schedule but still in the game. Vickers' team had maintained their lead, but the gap was narrowing. The final objective was the most difficult, a moving target at unknown distance, engaged from a concealed position. Both teams would attempt it simultaneously from opposite ridgelines. Whichever team scored more hits would win the exercise. Kale positioned her team on a rocky outcrop overlooking a valley. The target would appear somewhere in the basin below, moving unpredictably. They had 30 minutes to locate, range, and engage. She assigned sectors, each Marine responsible for a quadrant of the valley. Holt took overwatch, scanning for threats. Jin ran calculations based on ambient temperature and humidity. Nguyen prepped ammunition, ensuring every round was clean and ready. Ortiz lay beside Kale, spotting scope trained downrange. The target appeared 12 minutes into the wait. A silhouette moving at a steady jog 700 yards out. Kale saw it first. She called the range, adjusted for windage, and fired. Hit. Ortiz confirmed. 3 seconds later, Vickers' team engaged from the opposite ridge. Their shot went wide. Kale fired again. Another hit. The target changed direction, moving erratically now. Jin called corrections. Kale adjusted and fired. Missed, she cycled the bolt, breathed, and fired again. The target dropped. 3 hits. Vickers' team managed one before the exercise ended. The observers tallied the scores. Kale's team had won by a narrow margin. The Marines erupted in cheers and groans depending on which side they'd supported. Vickers walked across the valley to shake Kale's hand. His expression was complicated, respect mixed with frustration, admiration tempered by the sting of defeat. She met his gaze evenly. No gloating, no false modesty, just the quiet acknowledgement of two professionals who'd pushed each other to their limits. That night, the entire company gathered for the debrief. The captain who'd introduced Kale stood before them, his expression serious. What you witnessed this week wasn't about proving who's the best shooter. It was about proving that competence doesn't have a uniform. Captain Kale earned her place here not because command mandated it, but because she refused to let her past define her future. Some of you doubted her. That's human. But doubt without evidence is prejudice. And prejudice has no place in this corps. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Kale stood at the back of the room, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She didn't need validation, but the Marines needed to hear it. Slowly, one by one, they began to applaud. It started with Ortiz, then spread to Jin and Nguyen. Holt joined in, her clap sharp and decisive. Vickers was next, and when he started, the rest followed. The sound filled the room, a thunderous acknowledgement that carried the weight of earned respect. The Liberty passes were distributed. Kale's team celebrated quietly, exhaustion finally catching up with them. Vickers' team took their defeat with grace, already planning how they'd win the next competition. But the real victory wasn't measured in points or passes. It was measured in the way the Marines looked at Kale now. She wasn't an outsider anymore. She was one of them. A warrior who'd been broken and rebuilt, who'd lost everything and refused to quit, who'd earned her place through sweat and skill, and an unshakable refusal to be defined by anyone's expectations but her own. 3 months later, Kale stood before a different audience. The brass had taken notice of her performance, and whispers had begun circulating about a new program. The Marine Corps was developing an experimental unit focused on precision engagement and asymmetric tactics. They needed instructors, people who understood both combat and adaptation, people who could teach not just marksmanship but resilience. Kale's name had come up repeatedly. The general who interviewed her was blunt. "You're overqualified for this," he said. "You should be commanding a rifle company, not teaching boot lieutenants how to shoot." She smiled. "With respect, sir, I disagree. I've commanded, I've flown, I've led Marines into combat, but I've never taught anyone how to survive what I survived. That's what I want to do now. Teach them that losing something doesn't mean losing everything, that adaptation isn't weakness, that the Corps is stronger when we refuse to let circumstances dictate our worth." The general studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "You're hired. Report to Quantico in 2 weeks. You'll be running the Advanced Marksmanship and Tactical Adaptation course. Your curriculum, your rules, make it count." She left his office with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since the day she'd pinned on her wings. The road ahead would be difficult. Teaching was harder than doing, and she'd face skepticism again from a new generation of Marines who didn't know her story. But she'd faced worse. She'd faced death in a burning cockpit and come out the other side. A classroom full of doubters was nothing by comparison. Quantico welcomed her with the cold professionalism of an institution that had seen 1,000 innovations come and go. Her classroom was a cinder block rectangle with fluorescent lights and a whiteboard. Her students were a mix of officers and senior enlisted, all of them hand-picked for their potential. Most were men. Most carried the same skepticism she'd seen on the range in Arizona. She didn't introduce herself with credentials or war stories. She walked to the front of the room, picked up a marker and wrote a single word on the board: adapt. "This course isn't about making you better shooters," she began. "Most of you already know how to shoot. This is about making you better Marines, better leaders, better survivors. Over the next 8 weeks, I'm going to break every assumption you have about what's possible. I'm going to show you that the limits you think exist are illusions. And I'm going to teach you that the most dangerous weapon you possess isn't your rifle, it's your refusal to quit." She paused, letting the words settle. "Some of you are here because you want to be the best. Others are here because command sent you. It doesn't matter. By the end of this course, you'll all understand one thing: competence is earned, not given. And the earning never stops." The first day was brutal. She pushed them through drills designed to expose weaknesses, long-range shooting in adverse conditions, rapid target transitions under stress, fieldcraft exercises that required patience and precision. The attrition rate was high. 3 students dropped in the first week. 2 more followed in the second. But those who remained began to change. They stopped relying on bravado and started trusting in process. They learned to calculate instead of guess, to observe instead of assume. Kale moved among them like a phantom, offering corrections in a voice that was firm but never cruel. She knew their frustration because she'd lived it. She knew their doubt because she'd overcome it. By the 4th week, the skepticism had evaporated. The students stopped seeing her as an outsider and started seeing her as what she was: a master teaching a craft most of them would spend a lifetime trying to perfect. Her call sign, which had been absent from the earlier conversations, began to surface. They called her Phoenix. Not because she'd risen from the ashes. That was too poetic, too easy. They called her Phoenix because she'd burned and rebuilt herself into something different, something harder to kill. The name spread beyond her classroom. Other instructors heard it. Other students whispered it. Within a month, it was official. Captain Elise Cale, call sign Phoenix, the woman who taught a generation of Marines that survival wasn't about strength, it was about adaptation. The final exercise was a live-fire evolution conducted in the mountains of Virginia. Each student was given a sector, a target, and a deadline. They had to locate the target, range it, calculate the shot, and engage, all while being stalked by instructors playing the role of enemy observers. Failure meant starting over. Success meant graduation. Cale watched from a command post, monitoring their progress through encrypted comms. She didn't interfere, didn't offer advice. This was their test, and they had to pass it on their own. One student, a lieutenant named Briggs, encountered trouble. His target was positioned on a ridgeline 1,100 yards away, partially obscured by vegetation. The wind was gusting at 15 knots, shifting direction every few minutes. He'd been in position for 2 hours, unable to get a clean shot. Cale listened to his breathing over the radio, heard the frustration building. She keyed her mic. "Briggs, what do you see?" His voice was tight. "I see a target I can't hit." "Wrong, you see a problem you haven't solved yet. What's stopping you?" A pause, then quieter. "The wind, I can't predict it." "So stop trying to predict it, adapt." Another pause. Then the sound of him adjusting position, moving to a different vantage point where the wind's effect would be minimized. 30 seconds later, his rifle cracked. The target dropped. Cale smiled. He'd learned the lesson. Not that she had all the answers, but that he had the capacity to find them himself. All 15 students graduated. The ceremony was small, attended by a handful of senior officers and the commandant himself. Cale stood at attention as each student received their certification. When the last name was called, the commandant approached her. "Captain Cale, your work here has been exceptional. The Corps is better for it. We'd like to expand your program. More students, more resources. You'd have carte blanche to build something lasting." She thanked him, accepted the assignment, and returned to her office. The walls were bare except for a single photograph. Her old Huey, tail number 347, sitting on a tarmac in Helmand Province. She stared at it for a long time, remembering the weight of the controls, the sound of the rotors, the feeling of invincibility that came from mastering a machine designed to defy gravity. She missed it, would always miss it, but she'd found something else, something that mattered just as much. She was building a legacy not in the cockpit but in the people she trained. And that legacy would outlast any medal, any commendation, any fleeting moment of glory. Years passed. The program grew. Phoenix became a legend not because of her shooting, though that remained unmatched, but because of the Marines she shaped. They carried her lessons into combat zones across the globe. They taught others who taught others, creating a cascade of competence that redefined what the Corps expected from its warriors. Cale retired at 47, her body finally succumbing to the injuries she'd ignored for 2 decades. She left quietly, without fanfare, returning to a small house in Montana where the mountains reminded her of Afghanistan, and the silence was broken only by wind. But her story didn't end there. It lived in the call signs of pilots who'd learned to adapt when their aircraft failed, in the steady hands of snipers who'd been taught that precision was a product of patience, in the quiet confidence of leaders who understood that true strength came from acknowledging weakness and overcoming it. The Marines who'd laughed at her on that Arizona range were long gone, scattered to units across the world or retired into civilian life. But they remembered her. They told their children about the woman who'd missed her first 2 shots and then never missed again, about the pilot who'd lost her wings and learned to soar in a different sky. Elise Cale, call sign Phoenix, died at 63. The funeral was attended by hundreds of Marines, past and present, who'd come to pay their respects to a woman who defined what it meant to serve beyond circumstance. Her casket was draped in the flag she'd fought for, and the honor guard fired a salute that echoed across the valley. They buried her in Arlington, beneath a stone that bore her name, her rank, and a single word: adapt. It was the word she'd lived by, the word she'd taught, the word that had transformed her from a broken pilot into something far more enduring. The sky above Arlington was clear that day. the kind of blue that stretches forever and promises nothing. A formation of Hueys flew overhead, their rotors beating a rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat. They dipped in salute as they passed, a final acknowledgement from the aircraft she'd loved and lost. And in that moment, everyone gathered understood that some legacies aren't measured in medals or monuments. They're measured in the lives changed, the lessons taught, the quiet refusal to let pain define purpose. Elise Kale had been laughed at once. She'd been doubted, dismissed, underestimated, but she'd never quit. And in the end, that was the only thing that mattered.